heard it in other places as well, is that the glory, as far as that, one of the great glories of the Episcopal Church is the Book of Common Prayer.
Yes, it is.
Whether you're in America or you're in South India or Australia, it is what defines us as Anglicans. And the more my experience has been, the more that I know what's in it and the more that I use it, the more precious it becomes. We understand it better. It becomes part of who we are because of the language that we hear. Unfortunately, most of us don't hear much of the language. We hear what we hear on Sunday morning. And if we come to a confirmation, we might hear the confirmation language. Occasionally we'll hear the wedding language. Occasionally we'll hear the burial language, but it's not something that really sort of becomes who we are. So I thought that I'd spend a couple of weeks on it rather than just one, and spend today kind of as a run through, which if you were to sit down and open a book of make sure that you've got one, because I'm going to be referring to it. So there were a bunch out there, as long as you can see one. If you were to sit down and just sort of open it up and walk your way through it page by page, you get what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to sort of try and contextualize it a little bit. So that's kind of where we're going. That makes sense? And then next week we'll focus a little bit more. So what I wanted to do, and if you've got any questions at any point or comments or anything like that, just let me know and stop me. But I thought what I'd do is give you a little bit of, because I'm a historian, right? I can't help but do anything but give history. And I'll try and make it, sorry Nadine, no, I don't know some of these people. Anyway, why do we have a book, right? Why a book and no book, as opposed to no book? I mean, if you go to a lot of, let's say, sort of the big churches, the big box churches, they're not using books. We use a book. You may not use it every week when you're in the pew, but it defines who we are. So why a book as opposed to no book? Well, over the course of time, very early on in the 3rd century, 4th century, they started writing down prayers to help guide worship. And so these were what were called up there, what were called church orders. And they were developed locally, right? So what's called the apostolic constitutions came out of Syria. What was called the apostolic tradition came out of Rome. They were trying to be faithful to their background. And they developed these, and we have them. We have these available to us. They still exist. And then they were not necessarily just for worship, but for how you ran the church, right? Then they began to develop what were called sacramentaries. And these were books that were used in worship, that guided worship. For who? The clergy, right? How do you do this? What words do you say? All of that kind of stuff. And we've got these collections of prayers. Kind of one of the biggest ones, at least from our standpoint, was what was called the Leonine, developed by Pope Leo, the Leonine Sacramentary in the 6th century. And that became, and it still exists, like I say, you can find copies of it. That became very influential in our prayer book. A lot of the prayers in the Leonine Sacramentary are what we use on Sunday mornings in the collects of the day. Some of those are from the 6th century. Language updated, obviously, and not in Latin. So we've got that. And then, centuries later, the monastic communities began to develop books to guide all of their worship. So monastic communities would gather for morning and, for devotions throughout the days, right? Benedict and the Benedictine order, I forget, 6 prayer times throughout the day, and including in the middle of the night. And, so they had to have books that would guide all of those. And so they developed the Missal, right? So the 9th century. And then in conjunction with that, they began to develop the breviary, and I meant to bring one in, but I didn't, which was the monastic readings and daily prayers. So how, and you could use that as an individual if you knew how to negotiate your way through the book. there's a contemporary version, and I can't remember what it's called, Daily Prayer. Roman Catholics put it out. It's basically a breviary. If you think our prayer book is complicated, the Catholics think theirs is complicated. The breviary is hard to work, I know. But then, you needed other books to guide you through other things, like weddings and burials. And so they developed what were called manuals for how to conduct those. That was its own separate book. So you had a book of the daily stuff, you had a book of conducting public worship, and then you had this book called Manuals for doing all of these other kinds of things. And then if you needed a bishop, you had another book, right? So if you needed to ordain a priest or a deacon or another bishop or something like that, you needed another book called the Pontifical, all right? So you had all these books. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, of course, in the 16th century, we had this thing called the Reformation, and the church in England separated itself from Rome. Okay, you all have heard stories about this in one way or another. Yes, it had something to do with Henry VIII, but it didn't necessarily have as much to do with getting a divorce as everybody wants to make it play out. But that's kind of unimportant for what we're talking about here. But what the reformers in Britain wanted to do was get it out of Latin so that the people in Britain could understand it. They wanted to get rid of some of what was clearly sort of medieval Catholic theology, particularly the idea of purgatory and indulgences and all of those kinds of things, which generated the Reformation in itself. That was part of what was behind Luther's stuff. And so Thomas Cranmer, that's him up there, was really influential. He didn't just write it, but he was influential in the development of what was then known as the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. And that was the first one in 1549. Well, it got revised a little bit. And what I want to say, what was going on in the development of this prayer is you still had a lot of Roman Catholics in Britain. And then you had a lot of Protestants, mostly Calvinists, okay, reformers, not many Lutherans, but Calvinists. And of course, the thing that the ruling people wanted, whether it was a king or a queen, is that they wanted the nation united. And the way that united, everybody knew that the way that united it was common religion, right? You had the state church. And so how are you going to get these two groups together? And so what we're going to see over the next, just the next few bullet points is this going back and forth between who was in power and how the prayer book got revised. Okay, so all of this happened within the course of basically a century. This is, upsetting the Protestants too much, so let's tweak the language. Oh, this is making the Catholics feel alienated. Let's tweak the language. So there was a lot of language tweaking, and the first set was, 3 years later, in 1552, there was the first revision. Okay, so it didn't take long, and they're not mass producing these books. They're still pretty much for the clergy and what was left of the monastics. So, but Henry VIII, of course, was basically Protestant. I mean, he was protesting against Rome, and there were a lot of other Protestants. Well, Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, came in. She was Catholic, staunch Catholic. So she got rid of the Book of Common Prayer, pulled back in all of the Roman stuff, okay? And that happened for a while, and then she left, died, and Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne. And she, as part of her reign, she and Parliament or whatever passed what was called the Act of Uniformity. Everybody was going to use the same book, okay, and brought back the 1552 book. Okay, so yeah, 1549, 1552, Latin, 1552, all right? And so she said, I don't care what you, the classic thing is, I don't care what you think, just use this book. I don't care if you believe in the virgin birth. I don't care. Use this book. I don't, just use. So we're all the same because the prayer for the monarch was in there. As long as the prayer for the monarch is in there, you believe whatever you want about theology. Just everybody prays for the monarch. So then, a few years later, King James I came to power. So he was a Scot. Yeah, Presbyterian, and so the prayer book was revised again in 1604 to become a little more Protestant and a little less Catholic. All right. Well, then we had this wonderful thing called the English Civil War, and as a result of that, there was another revision of the prayer book, with the Catholics and the Protestants fighting, and then resolving it, and it came up with what was known as the Restoration, and then the Book of Common Prayer was revised to be the 1662 prayer book. The 1662 prayer book is still the authorized prayer book in Britain. It is still the authorized prayer book, all right? And we'll get on. But as Britain spread and colonized and established colonies, subsequent colonies began to develop their own prayer books. All right, and we're one of those, and I'll spend a lot more time on that. But here's the New Zealand prayer book. So the New Zealand, and the Australians have one, the Canadians have one. All right, so everybody sort of developed their own. The further they got from being a colony and establishing their own sort of national church, they would begin to develop their own national revision of the prayer book. So that gets us to 1776. That date is not up there, but that's the pivotal date at which we decided we were no longer going to be a colony. And in the 1662 prayer book, which was what was being used in the Americas, there was this little prayer in there for the monarch. And so very early on, the American church said, we've got to revise this. We have to revise this book to remove things that are clearly monarchical, royal, all right? So the very first prayer book in the Americas was the 1789 prayer book, and here is one. It's fragile, but you can see that the backing has come off. But if you want to pass it around and look at it. See, I was talking, I think it was to Kathy, she was saying, she had, see what a nice size that was? I said, see what a nice size this is? So the 1789 was the first one, and it hung around for a while. There were a lot of minor revisions for a while. Here's a version, this is even smaller than that one, from 1856. This wasn't a legitimate revision, but there were, typos, things like that, that there were a lot of little bits and pieces. So this one's 1856. If you were to look at it alongside that other one, you would see that there's very little. The next major revision was in 1892. These revisions, even though they were called revisions, were so minor from our standpoint that it's hard to see the differences. But here you can say that you've held an 1892 prayer book. Then we get to the really big one. Yeah.
Where did you get those?
Where did I get these? Different places, different times. Book sales at libraries, because libraries call old books and things like that. And I might go through and just take a look and say, oh, look at that one. I don't have that version. Or I might have. I can't even remember. It's been a long time, right? I graduated from seminary a long time ago. Anyway, sit down so that the camera can catch me. The main previous revision was the 1928 revision. So that's this one. This is the one that many of you may have grown up with if you were in the church for a long period of time. It stood the test of time, for a good long time. So this is the last major one. And they would come in different forms. There was also a hymnal. Some of those might even have hymns in the back. Yeah, all of these, just the words, no music.
Yeah.
So you would have all this going on there. Well, in all of these revisions, in all of the prayer books, dating back to Cranmer, and we'll talk about this a little bit further as we go through, are a collection of things called the Articles of Religion, also known as the 39 Articles. And these were sort of a statement of the English church about what it believed, how it was going to ground its theology. So it talked about what books of the Bible do we consider books of the Bible, because the Roman Catholics considered some that the Protestants didn't, right? And so there's this thing in there, and you'll see this if you go through, we'll get there in a minute. Well, one of the articles has to do with purgatory, and another one has to do with the Pope, and all these. But Article 24, that's printed up there, is of speaking in the congregation in such a tongue as the people understandeth it. Wonderful sort of Elizabethan English, Shakespearean Elizabethan English. And of course, this is to get the services of the people out of Latin, all right? So it is a thing plainly repugnant to the word of God and the custom of the primitive church. The English reformers wanted to go back to what was called the primitive church, okay, the church before it split into East and West, okay? So it's plainly repugnant to the word of God and the custom of to have public prayer in the church or to minister the sacraments in a tongue not understanded of the people. So it makes no sense to have the Latin Mass if nobody understands Latin.
I agree with that.
Okay? And so I bring that one out, not to talk about the Latin Mass, but because even though I don't think I ever heard that article invoked in terms of the development of the new prayer book, it stands behind the 1979 prayer book. It sort of stands behind some of the things that were done in this prayer book in terms of language. All right, and so I said that the 1662 prayer book is still the prayer book in Britain. Well, they've come up with a contemporary version. It's just, and it gets used all the time. It's called Common Worship. It gets used all the time, but it's not the official prayer book in Britain. Okay, but it's fine for use, but it's not the official. The official is 1662. Okay, so but this one gets it into a language understanding of the people. All right, we in the United States have in the American Church. We have not just an English prayer book, but we have two other languages in which we have issued official prayer books. We have Spanish, so here's the Libro de Oración Common, the Book of Common Prayer. What do you think the next language after Spanish is that we have an authorized Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal Church?
German.
No.
French.
French. Why?
Canadians.
No, this is the American Church. Canadians aren't the American Church.
Oh, okay.
Haiti.
Haiti, okay.
And what's so surprising for somebody like me who spent so much time on the West Coast, where you have a very different population, is that there isn't an official Chinese prayer book in Chinese language. Now, there have been prayer books that have been written, and I know one of the people who wrote that prayer book, the one in China, translated into Chinese, but it's not official. So you want the book to be in the language of the people. So that's what this book ended up doing a lot of. Minnie.
That just kind of makes me think about, is there a reason why they're not making it official? Because as we churches or congregations decrease in number, I would think that the church would do more things to be more inclusive and show inclusivity. So, we have a Chinese.
Yeah, see, and there's a huge Chinese population in New York, for example, so why, and Chinese churches. So why not? And I've asked that question. I don't know the answer. I think I can speculate that, the more official languages, the more work it is to do all of the publication of all of those kinds of things. And I can, that's the only reason that I can think of at this point. I really don't know, but it's a great question. And as somebody who worshipped with Chinese Episcopalians in the Bay Area, it was always a surprise that they didn't have that. So, all right, any other questions on history before we jump into this book? All right.
Question number one, why is it called the Book of Common Prayer?
Okay, so book you got, prayer you got. Why is it common? So it's the prayer that is common for all of the members of the church, for each church. So each Episcopal church in America, in the United States, uses this book or a variation of it. Services that have been authorized. So we've used things during the year called Enriching Our Worship, which is in some respects a beginning of a new revision where the language has changed even more. So one of the things that we'll see in here, in this book, are some of the changes in language. But in the Enriching Our Worship, this book was written really in the early 70s. It just became authorized in 1979. Questions of inclusive language weren't being raised in the early 70s, or at least not very loudly. And so the language in here is still pretty masculine. And so, so there are these new services, Enriching Our Worship, have tried to change some of that gendered language. And it's been authorized for our use. But there are certain things that we can't use unless I call the bishop up and say, can I use this? All right? That maintains our linkage to the common church. All right? It's a good question. All right, so real quickly, I just want to show you how the book is organized, and then we'll do a deeper dive as we move through there. This is just basically the table of contents, okay? So we've got some introductory bits, preface. There's usually a statement. Open your book. Right after the frontispiece, the page after the Book of Common Prayer, you'll see a little statement right in the middle of the page. I certify that this edition of the Book of Common Prayer has been compared with a certified copy of the Standard Book, which exists someplace, right? As the canon directs, and that it conforms thereto, noting that it may have been amended. And then there's the name of the custodian of the Standard Book of Common Prayer. All right. So this shows that this is an official book. Okay. Then you get the table of contents, and you get the ratification, and all these what I call the little bits, the preface, that kind of stuff. Then, and we'll get to this in a moment, some stuff about how we worship, and it has to do with the calendar. And then what we'll spend all next week talking about is the daily office, not so much about how it fits in the book, but how you use it. So that comes next. Then the Great Litany, which we'll talk about in a moment, which you may or may not have any familiarity with. Then the collects, and these are the prayers that we use on Sundays or at special feasts. So they may be about a saint or something like that, or appropriate to the Sunday. Then we get what are known as proper liturgies for special days, and we'll see these in a minute, but these are basically Holy Week. That's all that we consider special days. It starts at Palm Sunday, so there's the service in there for Palm Sunday, Ash Wednesday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Vigil. Those have their own section, okay? And then after that comes baptism, the service of baptism. And the logic for this is that, of course, Holy Week and Lent leads you up to Easter, which was a great time for baptism, readmission into the church. You hear that sort of exhortation on Ash Wednesday. And then you're baptized and admitted to what comes next, Holy Eucharist, right? So baptism is the entryway into being able to take communion. And one of the changes that was made from that 28 book to this book was that Eucharist was seen as the central thing for Christians. It's the thing that is supposed to be the main service of the day on Sundays. You can do other services, but the main service of the day is supposed to be Holy Communion. And so what they did is they put it in the center of the book. Relatively, rather than at the front or at the back, but they put it into the center. And so everything here is moved up to that point, okay? Then you get what are known as pastoral offices, and we'll talk about that. Then Episcopal services. So here, if you think back to all of those books from the medieval Catholic tradition, here we've got the daily office. We'll talk about that more. You've got daily prayers, right? And the prayers for worship, the collects. You've got the special services. They're all in this book. You've got the Eucharist. It's in this book. Then you've got these pastoral offices, how to deal with sick people and dead people and, people who want to go through confirmation. You've got those. And then you've got the Episcopal services, the thing that demand a bishop. They're all in one book. So that's another reason it's common. Everybody has access to all of these things all of the time. All right? Then, in this book, we have the entire book of Psalms. The entire book of Psalms is in this book. So, as well. Then a bunch of prayers and thanksgivings, we'll see that. Outline of the faith or the catechism, we'll see more of that. Some historical documents that will tie us back to some of these various other points in history. A great section of the book that hardly anybody looks at anymore, because you can get it on the internet. How do you find the date of Easter? I was surprised. Something came out in an official church thing a week ago or something that was talking about Easter, and there was a prayer for our Jewish brothers and sisters who are celebrating Passover. Not this year. Passover this year is still coming up a long way. Usually they're close to one another, but not this year. They're separated by quite a bit because the dating of Passover is different than the dating of Easter. Okay, unlike Christmas, which is December 25th. Easter moves based on full moons and other kinds of things, right? So how do you find that? And that used to be one of the things that kids would do when the sermon got bored, is they'd figure out how to find the date of Easter, and we'll look at that. And then you've got the lectionaries, the order of readings of Scripture, both on Sunday mornings and then for the daily office. And that's where things get really confusing for a lot of folks. So that's why I want to spend some time. Yeah, Pete?
So does Passover fluctuate that big of a variance every?
Not every year, but it does this year. It's really wide this year. Yep. Yeah. And historical side note, there was a big debate on how Easter should be calculated. Should it be calculated in conjunction with Passover? Because on the night before, the Paschal Lamb, all of those kinds of things, it should be dated there. Should it be dated, because we could figure out when that was in 30 AD, should it be on that day? Or should it be dated some other way? And those were big debates in the early church and were settled in the 5th and 6th century. So that's a good question. So early on in the book, and you'll see this, we're on now, I'm gonna have to talk fast. Page 15. Page 15. The calendar of the church year. So this tells us how, what is in here is how the year plays itself out and what has priority. And so the things that have priority for the church year are what are known as principal feasts: Christmas, Easter, Ascension, All Souls, or All Saints, Pentecost. These, many of them happen on a Sunday, not all. Ascension is always on a Thursday. Christmas can be any day of the week. All Saints' Day can be any day of the week. But if they fall on a Sunday, then they take precedence on that day. You're not going to celebrate the 17th Sunday after Pentecost when one of these feasts falls on it. You celebrate the feast that falls on it. So that's the big deal, the principal feast. Then the next thing is Sundays, because Sundays are feasts of the resurrection. And then after that, there are what are holy days. So presentation, or when the angel appeared to Mary, St. John the Baptist, or the Feast of the Transfiguration. These are lesser days, they're called holy days, they're not principal feasts. So those of you who came from a Roman Catholic tradition may remember holy days of obligation. And there are these different, well, this one isn't quite a holy day of obligation. And so these holy days, we wouldn't call them holy days of obligation. I don't think anybody would expect an Episcopalian to show up at church on the Feast of St. John the Baptist. You might do it if you were in a church that had these kinds of celebrations during the week. You might hold a special service for John the Baptist, but it wouldn't take precedence of anything. Okay. And then these other major feasts, Feast of the Apostles, depending on where you are on a Sunday, I think the rubrics say feasts appointed. Some of these, this goes back, some of these other feasts, major feasts, if they happen on a Sunday and they aren't one of the principal feasts, if they aren't one of the principal feasts, if it's a major feast that happens on a Sunday, you're given permission by the prayer book to use the lessons for that day instead of the Sunday lessons. But you're just not doing it. It's weird. Yeah, I know. So this tells you what all of the feasts are. And then on page 19 through the next 12 pages, you get what's happening each month. These are feasts that are set on the same day every year. So New Year's Day is the feast of the holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Episcopal calendar. All right, always. It's not New Year's Day, it's the feast of the holy name. So this gives you, if you ever want to know. So today, if we were actually following the church calendar, but we're in Easter, so that changes things a little bit. You'll see on page 22, on the 7th, it's not there's nothing going on. Tomorrow is the feast of William Augustus Muhlenberg. All right, y'all know who he was. Okay, these are known as lesser feasts. All right, so that's the calendar. That sort of governs how we move through the year. Then we get to the daily office, and we will talk about that next week. Just because I don't want to spend time going through it right now. But here we've pulled in that stuff that was really monastic. That was the monastic prayer cycle. And it was adopted in the Anglican world and morphed a little bit into stuff for everybody every day or every week. And it came out of into our prayers. All right, so that was part of that shift. Then, as I said, after the daily office, we get to the Great Litany, which is its own thing. It can be its own service. You can just have a church service that has the Great Litany, and it's a. Well, take a look at it. It's on 138, 48. It's a big back and forth series of praying, and often it would be done in times of peril. So if you were in the middle of a pandemic, you might be saying the Great Litany more often as a congregation. Or it's often in many churches done on the first Sunday of Lent. And it's often done what they would say is in procession. So the whole thing would be sung as the clergy and the choir are walking around the church, making a big procession around the church, and then ending up at the altar to begin this. So it's not entirely penitential, but there's a great flavor of penitential, a penitential flavor to it, and it is its own thing. All right, it's not used often, maybe once or twice a year at the most in most churches, but it's there. And again, it might be if there was, a war or something, then you felt the need to bring people together for a specific set of prayers. That would be this. Well, then we get into the prayers for the collects. So the collect of the day is usually the second prayer that I will say in on Sunday mornings, if we're doing the Eucharist. The first prayer is what's known as the Collect for Purity, and then we sing the Gloria, and then this is the prayer that comes after it that I sing, usually, okay? So these have, many of these, like I said before, come from the Leonine Sacramentary. And by the way, there are commentaries on the Book of Common Prayer. All right? So this one this was the first commentary on the Book of Common, was written by a professor of mine, Massey Shepard, and it was written on the 1928 prayer book. And anyway, he was brilliant, really helpful. A lot of these would say, well, this collect comes from this source, this collect comes from this source. That's why I remembered it. When the 79 book came out, obviously it had to have a new commentary. And so Marion Hatchett, who was, I think, at General Seminary at the time, wrote this one. So commentaries on it. Now, there are small books that help you understand it, but there are these commentaries, and helpful. So the collects, there will be the seasons of the year, so there are different prayers for Lent and Easter and Christmas. And then there's the long green season. You see the lower half of that circle, the long green season, which is the season that falls after Pentecost. And so we would call it, we just call them propers. In the Catholic Church and in other churches, they're often called ordinary time. That's not a feast, it's not a set feast. And so you see that a lot of times up there where it says Epiphany in the upper left hand, kind of between 10 and 12 o'clock on the clock. In the Roman Catholic Church, those Sundays are considered ordinary time. And then there's this big green piece that's considered ordinary time. We separate out the Feast of the Epiphany and call it Epiphany Tide between Christmas and Lent. We see that as its own season. So anyway, we have propers for all of those. Propers for the collects for the holy days, whether it's the Feast of the Holy Name or all of those, you'll find those in there. Common saints and various occasions that you can see as you take a look through there. So it might be for the a various occasion might be on the anniversary of the founding of a church. Okay, so you have a separate prayer for that, unless you were going to use it fell on a saint's day. Okie dokie, where are we? Okay, then the proper liturgies for special dates. Again, like I say, it's Ash Wednesday. These are all Lenten, right? Ash Wednesday, Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday. There is a Holy Saturday service. We did it during the pandemic because everybody was online, and I said, well, here's something to do on Saturday morning. And I forget how many people we had sign on, but we did. And it's Holy Saturday is an interesting day. It's the only day in the church year when the Eucharist is not celebrated anywhere. And it's not even given out. You get rid of the reserved sacrament after the service on Good Friday. If you're going to have communion on Good Friday, that's reserved sacrament from the night before. And then that's all gotten rid of, and there is no new bread and wine consecrated until the Easter Vigil. So that's the tomb. That is liturgically the tomb and symbolically the tomb, and we don't observe it. So there is its own service for Holy Saturday. And then the Great Vigil of Easter, which we do. Then we have the service of Holy Baptism. Usually, not usually, but often there are baptisms at Easter Vigil. And so it makes sense to have the service of baptism connected to that in terms of the flow of the book. Okay. Then we get into the Eucharist. And there's this, it begins with what's known as the exhortation. It used to be, in the old days, before this prayer book, when the assumption is that the principal service is going to be the Eucharist. If there's a priest present, of course there's some congregations where there's not always a priest, then they would be doing morning prayer on a Sunday morning. But if there's a priest present, the assumption is that there will be a Eucharist. Well, in the old days, when that was not the assumption, you might do Eucharist quarterly, or if more frequently, monthly. And you would announce in advance that this was the case. On Sunday next, or on, this is what we're going to do. So the exhortation there at the beginning of the Eucharist is telling people, we're going to be doing this, get ready, in much more flowery language. Then we have both Rites 1 and Rite 2. And this is where we began to pay attention to the language understood by the people. So in the 70s, from the 60s on, these and thous were not language that most people understood anymore, or the understandeth, right? Or all of that sort of Elizabethan language. Even though if you go to Quaker meetings and they still use these and thous, thee and thou was we think of thee and thou being formal, but it wasn't. That was the informal language. That was the language you would use familially. And you, that pronoun was the formal one. But the language turned, and we began to associate thee and thou with holy language and God and all of that. And we started to use the less formal language. What was the more formal language became less formal. So we had to change it. So we changed the prayer book, altered the language in some of the prayers. Now, Prayer A, Eucharistic Prayer A, which is the one that we use sometimes, we're using Prayer D now, looks a lot like the 1928 Prayer 1, or the Eucharistic prayer. It's the one that looks closest. It's just shifted the language a little bit, okay? And then the others were new prayers. Well, B and C were new prayers written for this prayer book. And Prayer D, the one that we'll be using today, and the one that I like to use during Easter and on All Saints' Day, that prayer is really taken from an ancient Orthodox prayer, Eucharistic prayer, centuries old, 1600 years old, translated into sort of contemporary English. So that's where all of the Rite 1 and the Rite 2 have to do with the modernization of language, and also a change in theology. And so that becomes very present, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on that because that's do another class on that. You'll see that there are forms in there for the prayers of the people. We don't have to use what's in the book. It says, here's 6 good examples of how to do it. And you just need to make sure that you cover these bases. And so the prayers that we'll be using today, or that we use today, cover all of those bases, but they're not found in the prayer book. They're written afterwards, and we use them so that we're not using the same thing. Every so often, we will use the prayers that are in the prayer book. Some churches never get out of those 6 forms that are in the prayer book. They just keep using them and never get out of them, which is fine. Then there's a section on communion under special circumstances, so that this feeds into, say, what our lay Eucharistic visitors would do. If you can't be at church, here's some way to participate in that. And then there's what's known as the order for celebrating the Holy Eucharist, which many clergy call Rite 3. And this is kind of write your own rite. That's how many people take it. But the instructions are very specific. They say this takes a lot of thought. This is not a throwaway thing. And what it was originally meant for was for communities, let's say Native American communities, for whom the way that the language in the prayer book and the order in the prayer book wasn't as appropriate, or they might want to add some other features to the worship. So this allowed for some flexibility, but again, it took a lot of thinking and a lot of planning. And it wasn't just, oh, well, let's do a Rite 3, and we'll pull from here and pull from here and pull from here and pull from here. That wasn't what it was meant to be, but that's how it sort of has gotten used. So intent is not always translated into action. Yeah?
So Gary, if you were to use that and put your own service together, would you have to get the permission of the bishop to, would she have to look at your service?
I think it depends on how bizarre it might get. Usually, if you're going to use anything that hasn't been authorized,
Okay.
So enriching our worship has been authorized, but I wanted to use I forget, something a year or so ago, maybe it was for Earth Day, I had a particular thing, and it wasn't an authorized liturgy at that point. I had to ask the bishop's permission to use it. And, you know, she usually says, I just want to know. I'll usually say yes, but let's keep, you know, just let me know. But yeah, there is that question every so often. I have to figure out what we can do. I was on a group call a couple weeks ago, and we were looking, part of the conversation wended into the reading of John's Passion narrative, which often refers to the Jews, and it's become problematic in anti-Semitic stuff that here on this solemn service we're blaming the Jews for everything, and certain translations do that, and people were just tearing their hair out because, well, we've got to change the language. I said, use a different translation. We don't have to use the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible just because the church prints it. We have other versions of the Bible that we can use. Just find one that doesn't say the Jews. Oh, wow, how clever. You know, so we can use resources that are available to us, and then there are those that we might have to ask permission for. So anyway, good question. After the Holy Eucharist, here are the pastoral offices. This is the one where we had the manuals, the old manuals. So confirmation, commitment to Christian service. Let's say somebody wanted to devote themselves to something for a year or 5 years or something. You might do a public service of commission. Marriage, thanksgiving for the birth or an adoption of a child. This one used to be called the churching of women. And what that meant, what that was, it was the old service of purification after childbirth, right? You know, you became, going back, you go to Leviticus and all those books, you know, that once giving birth made you unclean, right? So this used to be called the churching of women. So you could come back in. Now it's called the thanksgiving for birth or adoption. Again, change in theology, change in understanding, reflected in the prayer book. Reconciliation of a penitent, confession. There are two different rites in there, not having to do with rite 1 or rite 2, but just two. Some of these were not in those older prayer books, but were added into this prayer book, into the 79 book. Ministration to the sick, ministration at the time of death, last rites, right? Order for burial. So all of that stuff is in this book, all of it. And there are some real gems of prayers hidden in some of these that you would never see because you just never hear them. One of my favorites, let's see if I can find it really quickly, is in the prayers for ministration to the sick. Page 461. So here, you wouldn't think about looking at this, but here's a whole page for prayers for use by a sick person. So when you're sick, here are 4 prayers, and the one at the very bottom is just beautiful. This is another day, O Lord. I know not what it will bring forth, but make me ready for whatever it may be. If I am to stand up, help me stand bravely. If I am to sit still, help me sit quietly. If I am to lie low, help me do it patiently. And if I am to do nothing, let me do it gallantly. Make these words more than words, and give me the Spirit of Jesus. Now, isn't that just a gorgeous prayer? And why is it for being sick? Why is it just an everyday prayer? You know, but you wouldn't see it because we don't look through this book very often, especially to these places. Well, I'm not sick, or I'm not ministering to the sick, so I wouldn't look at that. But they're there. All right. Then we get to the Episcopal services. This is where you need a bishop. You need a bishop for other bishops. You need a bishop for a priest. You need a bishop to make a deacon. Then there are the prayers, the litany, the big set of prayers at ordinations. Celebration of a new ministry, what happens when a new clergy person comes in and takes a church. There's a new version of that in Enriching Our Worship, which we used when I started here a couple of years ago as the new ministry. And what do you do when you have a new building or you take over an old building? How do you make it a church or a chapel? You need a bishop to do that. And so that's all of those services are in this book. Then the Psalter, all 150 of them. If you go down into the weeds, you'll find out that the numbers of the verses aren't necessarily the same numbers as you'll find in the Bible. There are little tweaks for for using them in public worship. But it also gives you instructions on how to read it. You know, we generally do it, we're gonna respond by half verse or whole verse. Every so often we get somebody who will say, well, let's read it together. And some people will say, we're gonna have this half of the congregation do one, this half of the congregation, men read this, women read this. I mean, all of those are possible, but we tend to fall back on some of the tried and true ones, whole verse or half verse, or in unison. Those are the ones that most of us most often use. Then we have a whole series of prayers and thanksgivings. Prayers for the world, the church, national life, social order, natural order, prayers of family and personal life, and then some other prayers. And then we have a similar set of thanksgivings. So some are petitions. The prayers are generally petitions. May the church do this, may this happen for the world, all of that kind of thing. Thanksgiving, we give thanks for this church for what it does. We give thanks for the world. We give thanks for the social order, what we can do. So there's a series of prayers and thanksgivings. These are not necessarily, they can be used every so often. I'll pull one of these when I say the prayer at the end of the prayers of the people. I'll choose one from here. But these are prayers that you can use individually. After that, we get to what is called in this prayer book an outline of the faith, commonly called the Catechism. This is what Episcopalians, sort of I don't want to say the minimum standard, but it's a relatively good summary of how Episcopalians think theologically over the course of time. Everything about who are the persons of the Trinity, to what are the orders of ministry, to there are a lot of others now. I just had what are the sacraments? All of those kinds of things are in that document. We don't use it in quite the same way that other churches do. When I say we, the Episcopal Church doesn't use it in quite the same way that maybe the Presbyterians or even the Lutherans do, Catholics. Then we have this section, historical documents. Susan thinks I need to preach on these more. She likes it when I do, because she says it gets people looking at the back of the prayer book, where we don't often do. But you know, when things get a little dull, people do go back there, and you get some heavy theological stuff. Definition of the union of the divine and human natures in Christ. The Creed of St. Athanasius, which has to do with how we understand the nature of the Trinity. The preface to the very first book of Common Prayer is considered a historical document and is there at the back of this book. Then those 39 articles, they're all there in Elizabethan English. And you can read about the Pope and his detestable enormities, and all those other wonderful things that are in that. It's great. And then the most recent of all of those is what's known as the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral from the late 19th century. This was developed, I think Muhlenberg had something to do with it. This guy whose feast we'll celebrate tomorrow is sort of the standards upon which Anglicans would enter into union with other Christian bodies. And there are basically four, what's called a quadrilateral, because there were four features: the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, the historic, the sacraments, baptism, and Eucharist. We've got, I'm trying to remember the third one. The creeds, the historic creeds, the Apostles' and Nicene Creed contain everything that we believe. And then the historic episcopate. So the bishops, the line of bishops. And so we say that those are the four things that if we're going to enter into talks of unity with other Christian bodies, we have to be in some agreement on these. And it's that last one about the historic episcopacy that is the sticking point. Because even the Lutherans don't understand bishops like we do. We understand them more like Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, but the Presbyterians don't have bishops at all, you know, and the Methodists don't understand it. So how are we going to get past? Are we going to stick with that word and what it has meant? Or are we going to stick with an office and kind of have a dynamic understanding of what that's going to be like? So that's been the sticking point, but that's been a very important document. then we get these tables, and so here's how you find holy days, and if we had more time, I'd walk you through some of this. But now you can go to the internet and you say, well, when's Easter in 2050, and you got it. You know, you don't have to go, but you used to have to go back and figure all of this out, and there are all of these tables that you can go back. And there was a cartoon, I wanted to find it to put up here, and it came out 2 weeks ago, one of these Episcopal churches. And there's a priest standing at a blackboard and writing all of this stuff down. It looked like algebra. And somebody comes up and says, Rector, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to calculate the date of Easter. You know, and it was kind of like, what seminary did he go to? It's in the back of the prayer book. You know, or you use the internet. So anyway, funny. Then we have the lectionaries, and we have 2 lectionaries in the prayer book. One governs the readings that we use on Sundays and on holy days, significant holy days. And it's a 3-year cycle. And so in year A, we read Matthew. In year B, which we are now, we read Mark. In year C, we read Luke. Mark is so short that we augment Mark with a lot of John in year B. Okay, so, but it's really Mark. And so you'll hear today we're reading John. Okay, so we sort of jump back and forth in year B between Mark and John.
And yours start with that.
Yeah, it starts on the first Sunday of Advent. And if you go back there, it tells you it's the first Sunday of odd years or something. And it's kind of weird. And again, just look it up on the internet, right? Then there's a 2-year cycle. That's the daily office, and it gives 3 lessons per day, and we'll talk about this next week, 3 lessons per day. And basically the idea is that over the course of 2 years, if you read everything in the daily office lectionary, you'll get through the whole Bible in 2 years, in general. There's some stuff that they skipped, but and then there are prayers for lections for the holy days, commons of saints, and various occasions. So if you're going to do a service of I'm trying to think of what's a good various occasion. Well, if you were going to do the celebration of the anniversary of a church, founding of a church, they would give lessons for that. Daily office, and we'll do that next week. So, yeah, that was as far as I wanted to get. Questions? This is an incredible treasure. And we don't use it enough. You know, I went to seminary a long time ago. I used it all the time in seminary. I've been ordained 40 years or 30 years, and I've been, you know, so it's been part of who I've been for the last 50 years, almost. And so for me, it's a significant thing. And we are talking now, and I'll just say this in the next minute. You know, the conversations at General Convention now are we going to undertake another revision? And part of it is language has changed, okay? Theology has changed a little bit. And do we, and some of the additional services that we've written and have been authorized reflect that. So there is a service for the celebration of a name change. Now, why would you do that? Well, it could be something as, I don't want to say simple, but something as kind of normal as a divorce, and you want to return to a different name. But it could also be somebody who's transitioned from male to female, female to male, and wants that name change acknowledged, blessed by the church. Now, that's not something that people were doing in 1979. If they did it, they weren't doing it publicly. You know, so these are coming out. So given the expense of printing these books, and the fact that hardly anybody uses them, they sit in the pews because everything is being printed in a bulletin or something. So if we revise the book of common prayer, do we still create a book? Or does it all reside in the cloud? But then it's not a book. So these debates go on. And I don't know where they're going to come up. So some of it's theological, some of it's very practical. Or practical related to theological. If we're printing all of these books, we're cutting down a lot of trees, is that theologically, is that good theological stewardship? When we can just have it in the cloud. But then we're still printing it, unless we're projecting it. But that doesn't mean we have a book. You know, what are you going to use at home? So these debates are really intriguing, and we're in a new world where they've taken on a different flavor. So, any final questions before we stop here?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that I have deeply appreciated the Book of Common Prayer. I'm a cradle Presbyterian, and one of the things I learned when I started coming to Good Shepherd was after Donald Trump was elected president, and I needed to get back into church on a regular basis, was that the Presbyterian Church has the Old Testament and New Testament. We have 4 scripture readings every single Sunday. And I love the lectionary because all of the selections get together on one compiled message. I mean, the amount of time and energy that went in to that, find that connection, had to be done by monks hundreds of years ago, but they're all connected, and I love that.
Yeah, the process of the writing of this, the composition of the 79 book, which I was in seminary when some of this was still happening, and all of these books of what were called books for trial use. There was the zebra book and the green book, and everybody had all these books, and they were trying them out in church, and it said, does this feel good? And then they would, use it, and then there were a whole series of documents called prayer book studies that were the compilation of the committees that were working on the lectionary, on the Eucharist, on baptism, on all of these kinds of things, working on all of the theological implications and background and all that was distilled into the words on these pages. And this whole series of prayer book studies of about 20 volumes. Interesting
I
stuff.
want to add just something to what Irma said, just as an aside, not related to the prayer book. But in addition to how beautifully the lessons and the psalms are put together, if you haven't been to church yet today, listen to how beautifully Connie puts the music in to match the lessons. It's just, she does an incredible job of doing that.
Yep. So, anyway, come back next week, we'll do a deep dive into the daily office.